So as I said at the beginning, we're up to Matthew chapter 5 as we move through the narrative lectionary journey through the Gospel of Matthew. So far we've read about the birth narratives in chapters 1 and 2. We have had Jesus baptised in Matthew chapter 3, and last week we had the temptation in the desert and Jesus calling of his first disciples to follow him. So last week I reminded you that Matthew has a bit of a pattern that he structures his gospel in. He's got the intro and the conclusion in his gospel, but then he has these 5 blocks or discourses, we call them, where he starts with some action about what Jesus is doing, about what Jesus, maybe the miracles or the things that Jesus is interacting with different people. And that's followed by a block of teaching. And he does that 5 times in this pattern. And we are currently in the first discourse, sometimes called the ethical discourse. And we can see that the action in this discourse were the things like I just mentioned, the baptism, the temptation, the calling of the first disciples, and the block of teaching we've just hit today, which is the Sermon on the Mount, which goes from Matthew's chapters 5 through to Matthew chapter 7. I mentioned a few weeks ago that a helpful hint sometimes when you're reading the Gospel of Matthew is that Matthew likes to build up to a point. He does it in his entire Gospel, but he also does it within the Gospel as well. So he'll put narrative or teaching to build up to a point. And a hint is that you can actually sort of like skip ahead and read the last page or read the point that Matthew is trying to make, and then go back and read the passages in the lead up with, through those glasses or through that lens, and suddenly go, I see what Matthew's doing here. He's putting these things together to get to make this point or to get to this conclusion. So, for example, if we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, what's Matthew's final point in the Sermon on the Mount? What does the Sermon on the Mount, well actually I should say Jesus/Matthew, because Jesus is preaching this thing. What does Jesus build up to, the last thing that he makes in the Sermon on the Mount? Does anybody know that off the top of their head? What's the last point of the Sermon on the Mount? Yell it out. Did you know it was that? No, that's a bit later. No, that's in the middle, sorry. The last point in the Sermon on the Mount was the story of the building the house upon the rock and the sand. Actually, the very last line is people were amazed by his teaching because he had authority. Put that one aside. The last thing that Jesus speaks about in the Sermon on the Mount is build your life upon the rock or the sand. And so he has this line that if anybody hears these words and put them into practice, is like a person who builds a house upon the rock. Or anyone who hears these words and does not put them into practice is like a person who builds a house upon the sand. And so if you take that and go, all right, if that is the point that Matthew has, or / Jesus, has built up to, and that's the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, then you can go back to the rest of it and go, when we're reading this, we have to not only hear these words, we have to put them into practice. So therefore, the point that John made earlier, this sermon is not theoretical. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's not that sort of teaching. Instead, it's the sort of teaching where Jesus is going, I'm giving you some examples, some ethical teaching about how you live. And it only works if you put these into practice. If you don't put them into practice, it's like building your house on the sand. It doesn't work. Instead, you've got to hear these words and put them in practice. Is that making sense? And so I think as we move through the Sermon on the Mount, we need to have that set of glasses on, so to speak. Always thinking, what does it mean for us to live this out? I can use an example, like the one, when Jesus said, you are the light of the world. I love that what was it? It brings out the colours of the world. You are the light that helps bring out the God colours of the world. What a beautiful way of putting it. But yes, I've got the NIV on the screen here. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people put light on a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. That is the teaching that Jesus put out there. And we could just respond to that and go, yeah, that makes sense. That's a good piece of teaching. But Jesus himself goes on and adds this next part, which is, well, then how are you going to put it into practice? In the same way, let your light shine before others so all may see your good deeds and give glory to your Father in heaven. Can you see that point? It's not only the teaching, it's the application as well. We got to put this into practice. And so that's, we need to be reading the Sermon on the Mount with those lens on. How do we put this into practice? All right, let's jump into working through these verses then. We start at the beginning of Matthew chapter 5. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came with him, and he began to teach them. A lot even in this first couple of verses here. Remember how Matthew is speaking to a Jewish audience and likes to link things back to the Old Testament. The very fact that this is happening on a mountainside is significant because in the Old Testament, often really important things or great things happened on mountains. And so it was almost like Matthew is trying to point back and go, this is happening on a mountain. Remember all those other things like, Abraham and Isaac's sacrifice, Moses and the 10 Commandments, Elijah meeting God on the mountain. There's a whole stack of them I could go through. He's going, this is also happening on the mountain. Therefore, recognize this teaching is important. But then the question comes, Jesus sat down to teach them. Who's the them in that sentence? Who has Jesus sat down to teach? Is it the crowd? Is it the disciples? Who is the them that Jesus is going, he sat down to teach them? Well, it's probably a bit of both, don't you think? Like, Jesus obviously knew the crowd was there because it says in verse 1, the crowd was there. He scooted up the hill to accommodate them so that making sure that everybody could hear him speaking. But I want to suggest, and actually a number of commentators suggest, that whilst Jesus was speaking in a way that everyone could hear, he was actually teaching the disciples. He was teaching the disciples about, if you are going to follow me, then here is the ethical teaching that I want you to follow. This is how to live the kingdom values that you have decided to implement in your life. And whilst he was teaching the disciples, he had no problems for everyone else to hear, but it was actually teaching the disciples. Can you see the very subtle difference between the two? I think this is important because the Sermon on the Mount is full of moral and ethical teaching, but it's not something that I think that Jesus demands, actually the whole world has to do this. He's saying, no, it's the people who choose to follow me that I'm inviting to do this. This is for my disciples. The rest of the world, hey, it's beneficial for you as well, but this is for my disciples, for anyone who decides to follow me. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus, to live this out. So it's almost like Jesus saying, if you're with me, if you trust me, then let these words change you and challenge the way that you live. So Jesus began to teach. And that's where we get in verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. I'm not going to read them all out. You've already heard them this morning. These are some of the most profound words of any of Jesus' teaching. But at the same time, this can be quite confusing. And we could easily spend the next month and a half just going through the beatitudes because there is so much in them. We find them confusing because on the surface they don't make a lot of worldly sense. If you look around, those who are mourning aren't always comforted. The merciful are not always shown mercy, and the meek definitely do not inherit the earth. These statements do not reflect the reality of the world that we live in. So instead, we suggest they're spiritually true, not worldly true. It is an insight or a glimpse of something bigger that Jesus is trying to build. Often when I preach, I will listen to other people's sermons to hear how they tackle a particular topic or what insights that they use. I found a really, really good sermon on this one. I actually preached it myself 3 years ago here. Do you remember it? It's a cracker of a sermon. If you want to learn more about the Beatitudes, we have every sermon for the last 4.5 years on our website. Do you even know that? We're running out of room on our website, and there's a bit of a question mark. Do we start taking some of these off? And I'm going, there's such a good resource sitting on our website. So if you go back 3 years ago, it's called Words from the Hill. It's a really good sermon about the Beatitudes. But anyway, I shouldn't put myself up. But I do make a point in there I actually want to bring back because I think it was really interesting. One of the things I read back then when I was preparing that sermon was a person who was comparing the teachings of Jesus with some of the contemporary teachers of their time, or some of the teachers that people were engaging with at the time, not a contemporary. And this person was comparing the Beatitudes, the Jesus teaching, with Aristotle. Is this sounding familiar? No. I reckon you can remember a sermon about 18 months. So this was 3 years ago. So I'm fine. So Aristotle, when he was teaching 300 years before Jesus, has a whole lot of teaching about happiness, because Aristotle would say that the goal of life is to be happy, and that's what you pursue in life. Life is about making sure that you are happy. And he actually wrote a series of statements about what it means to be happy, how to be happy, or how to find that, well, the words he used was flourish in life, or flourish in happiness. One commentator is sort of saying, if you hold these two things together, you could almost see Jesus going, I know that there's people around who are reading Aristotle and are trying to be happy through his teaching. How's that going? Is that working out for you well? If it's not, here is another lot of teaching about what it means to be blessed. And this blessing is different, but it will actually bring you much more life than Aristotle's teaching. And actually, I think this is highlighting a larger picture of what Jesus is trying to do in the Sermon on the Mount. It's like Jesus is pushing back against some of the worldly teaching that is around during his time. He's saying to people, just don't accept the status quo. Don't accept the current accepted teaching, but rather let's engage with this and wonder why we're just doing this, and consider whether there may be another way to be engaging with life or living out. So, in other words, it's sort of like, you've got these worldly philosophies or teaching, and Jesus is saying, well, I know you know this, but I'm going to teach you this instead. And you can see that pattern. For example, we look at blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. If you look at this from a worldly point of view, well, Aristotle actually would suggest that a time of mourning or deep loss is not happy. So therefore is not about achieving the goals in life. And Aristotle said that mourning should only be done very briefly and then move on back to getting to the goal of being happy again. But Jesus in the Beatitudes puts forward a different way. He says, those going through the process of mourning, the kingdom of God, and in God's kingdom you will be blessed and comforted. As children of God, you will discover that if you turn to God in these difficult times, you will experience a loving and compassionate God who is there with us, bringing us comfort and help. And it may not immediately bring happiness, but that's not what it's about. Instead, we discover that we are blessed. Do you know what I mean? I don't know, if you, for those of us who have been through loss or the pain of grief, were there points during that you sort of discovered a peace, a settledness that comes to you that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense? I've heard people saying, if it wasn't for my faith, I don't think I would have made it through my grief. And when I ask, what is it about your faith that helped you through that grief? They go, I'm not really sure. I just know that God was with me, that my faith was something that I could hold on to. It was like a rock in the midst of that storm. I once heard people say it was like Jesus was holding me in my brokenness and very slowly putting me back together again. This is what it means to be blessed. It doesn't make sense from a worldly point of view, but from a kingdom point of view, we suddenly go, yeah. And we can put this idea alongside any of the Beatitudes. The world is saying that this is the way to happiness or success, but Jesus says, actually, there's a better way that leads to blessing and life, a blessed life. This pushing against the current teaching is the same approach in the second half of the chapter, part of the chapter we didn't read, but I'm encouraging you to read this week. When Jesus is pushing it back against worldly teaching, actually it's not really worldly teaching. This time he's pushing back against the religious teaching of the time, the religious understanding of the Turramurra of the Bible. In verses 21 to 47, which is the second part we didn't read, Jesus uses this pattern where he sort of says, you've heard it said this, but now I'm going to tell you this. You've heard people explain, the way of living like this, but now I say this. And there's a whole lot of them. It says, you've heard that do not murder, but I say that being angry with your brother or sister is just as bad. You've been taught, do not commit adultery, but I say lust of the mind is the same. If you follow the teaching, an eye for an eye and pay back in equal measures, but I now say, don't do that, turn the other cheek, give your coat as well, walk the extra mile, as John talked about in his kids' talk. If you adhere to the teaching of loving your neighbour but hating your enemy, Jesus says, I'm going to show you a different way, where we actually are called to love our enemies and pray for our persecutors. And remember, this is not theoretical. We're supposed to be putting this into practice. That's what the whole point of the Sermon on the Mount is about. Anyone else thinking that the bar is set up probably a little bit too high here? That what Jesus is asking us to do is almost impossible for us to actually do? Well, Jesus is setting the bar high. In verse 20, Jesus says that our righteousness must surpass the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, who were known for their adherence to the law. Otherwise, we won't enter the kingdom of heaven. And then in verse 48, if you keep on reading through this chapter, Jesus finishes by saying, well, I want you to be perfect, like your Father in heaven is perfect. This bar is set really high. We are called to be perfect like God. Keith Green, a Christian singer-songwriter in the 1980s, once said that Jesus doesn't offer any compromises here. That Jesus doesn't lower the bar at all to make it easier for us to get over. The bar is set high because this is the path that brings transformation in our lives and in our world. So Jesus doesn't lower the bar so that we can put these things into practice. But at the same time, Jesus doesn't want us to continually fail as well. And we're probably skipping ahead too far in our journey through the Gospel of Matthew here, but we already know the answer to this. We know the good news of grace that God offers to help us through grace and forgiveness to allow us to strive to, achieve this in our lives, or to put these teachings into practice, and in doing so transform our lives and our world. It is all about forgiveness and grace, but that comes later in the gospel, so I'm going to pause on that one and come back. So the question is, so what do we do with this? We've still got another 2 weeks of the Sermon on the Mount to go. This is just the beginning of it. And we're called to live this out, and already we're going, whew, this is full on. What do we do with this? What do we do with this? In this first part of the Sermon on the Mount, we can see what Jesus is trying to do. Offer us a model for Christian living that stands against worldly thinking. The teaching reminds us that true blessedness is not found in wealth or power or status, but is actually found in following Jesus. The challenge is that we have to live a life that puts this teaching into practice. It's actually really hard. I was struggling. How do I wrap this sermon up? Because the Sermon on the Mount isn't finished yet. We're only a third of the way into it. And so it's really hard to put a bow at the end of the sermon. Jesus has got a lot more to reveal to us yet. It's almost like we're sitting in the middle of an orchestra as they're tuning up. And it seems a little bit chaotic and a bit all over the place at the moment. But I want to encourage you that there is a bigger picture that Matthew/Jesus is doing here. And we will get to a point where that tuning starts to become the same. And we'll go, I see it now. I see what Jesus is trying to show me here. We might go, I can see why this path is the way to life. But in the meantime, my encouragement to you is, let's remember that we are indeed the light of the world. That the world is looking at us from the darkness. And I pray that we may be reflecting that light and love and grace of God in all that we do and say. So, in the words of Jesus, let your light shine before all people, so they may see what you are doing and give glory to God. Amen.